She did not cry. That was the thing she remembered most clearly, years later. Not what he said, not the faces of the other women at the table, but the fact that she did not cry. He had said it the way a man announces the weather. Flat. Almost bored. You know, Cecily always said you had the plainest face she'd ever seen on a woman of your station. He reached for his wine glass without looking at her. I confess I've come to agree with her. Cecily was his sister. Cecily was seated 2 chairs to his left, examining her fingernails. Matilda set down her fork. The silver clicked against the porcelain, and in the quiet of the Caldwell dining room, it sounded very loud. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at her husband. This man she had been given to 14 months ago by a father who called it a good match and meant the land that came with it. And she saw something she had not expected to see. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, just nothing. An empty space where a person should have been. She rose from her chair. She pushed it back carefully so it would not scrape. She dipped her chin. Not a curtsy, not quite, but a small precise acknowledgement. The kind one gives a stranger one does not intend to see again. And she walked out of the dining room. No one called after her. She climbed the stairs with her hand on the rail and went into the room that had been assigned to her when she arrived as a bride, the room with the blue curtains that Cecily had chosen because she said they suited the light. They did not suit the light. They turned the morning gray and cold, and Matilda had learned not to open them until nearly noon, when the sun had moved enough to stop fighting the fabric. She stood in the center of that room and was still for a long moment. Then she pulled her trunk from beneath the bed. She had married Aldrich Caldwell in September of 1868, 2 weeks after her 24th birthday. The ceremony was held at her father's house in Dorset because the Caldwell family, her father explained, had been generous enough to accommodate them, and it was only right that the Vane side provide the setting. Her father's name was Mr. Vane. Her mother had died when Matilda was 11. There was no one to ask about the small domestic mechanics of being a wife. How to manage a cook who had been with the household longer than you had. How to request changes to a menu without causing offense. How to sleep in a bed next to a man who did not reach for you, and whom you did not want to reach for either. She had learned by watching. She was good at watching. The Caldwell estate was called Harrogate, which she thought was an unfortunate name for a place where a person was supposed to build a life. It sat on 1,200 acres in Wiltshire, most of it farmland, some of it disputed. The dispute was the reason the match had been made at all. Her father held the deed to a parcel of land on the eastern border that the Caldwells had been arguing over for 2 generations. The marriage was the resolution that both parties agreed was cleaner than a lawsuit. She was not told this before the engagement. She found out 6 weeks after the wedding, when she came across the correspondence in the study while looking for ink. She did not make a scene. She folded the letters back the way she'd found them and returned them to the drawer and stood at the window for a while, looking at the eastern fields. Her eastern fields, as it turned out, or rather, the fields her body had been traded for, and she thought, all right then. Now I know what this is. Cecily Caldwell was 28, unmarried by choice, and ran the house the way a general runs a campaign, with maps, with systems, with an absolute refusal to cede ground. She had managed Harrogate since she was 19, when their mother died, and she had managed it alone for 9 years by the time Matilda arrived to displace her. She never said she resented it. She was too clever to say it. Instead, she said things like, "Of course you'd want to do it that way, coming from a smaller household, and Aldrich has always preferred the lamb prepared the other way. But you couldn't have known that, and I only mention it because I want you to feel at home." Aldrich said nothing. That was the pattern Matilda came to understand over the first year of her marriage. His sister spoke. He was silent. His silence was interpreted as agreement. His agreement was then used as authority. She had tried, in the early months, to speak to him privately about it, choosing evenings when Cecily had retired, sitting near him with her hands folded, choosing her words the way you choose footing on an icy path. He would listen. He would nod. He would say, "I'll speak with her," and then he would not speak with her, and the next morning it would begin again. She stopped trying around April. By June she had learned to move through the house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome and knew it and was too proud to mention it. She had, she supposed, been the perfect wife by every visible measure. She managed what Cecily allowed her to manage. She appeared at every dinner. She poured tea with the right degree of attention. She was neither too warm nor too cold with the staff. Though she had made one mistake early on. She'd thanked Mrs. Draper, the cook by name, with real feeling, for a particular soup that had been very good, and Cecily had mentioned later that the staff tended to get ideas when they were addressed too personally. She hadn't thanked Mrs. Draper like that again. But she had started leaving small things on the kitchen table when she passed through in the mornings. Once a jar of the jam her father sent. Once a book of patterns she thought Mrs. Draper might enjoy. Nothing that could be called a gift. Nothing that could be called anything, really. Mrs. Draper began leaving an extra slice of bread beside her breakfast plate. These were the small kindnesses that sustained her. She packed carefully. There was no point in hurrying. Aldrich would not come upstairs, and Cecily would not either. Because Cecily was the kind of woman who won by outlasting rather than by following. She took her own clothes. She took the small traveling case her mother had left her, the one with the brass latches that still worked. She took the letters from her father. She took the book she had been reading, because she was part way through it, and the idea of not knowing the ending was suddenly intolerable. She did not take anything that Aldrich had given her, because Aldrich had not given her very much. She left the ring on the dressing table. She sat for a moment on the edge of the bed. Not her bed, she thought. She had always thought of it as not quite hers. And looked at the blue curtains that turned the morning gray, and she thought about all the mornings she had waited for the sun to move. She counted them, approximately. There were over 400. She would not count them anymore. She carried the trunk to the top of the stairs herself. It was heavy and she managed it without making much noise. She was proud of that, in a small way. She had always been stronger than people expected. The house was quiet by the time she reached the entry hall. The long case clock in the corridor read 11:45. She had packed, she realized, with some efficiency. She let herself out through the side door, the one that opened onto the kitchen garden. The night was cold and clear, and the gravel crunched under her boots, and she kept walking. There was a coaching inn 3 miles south called the White Stag. She had passed it many times in the carriage, and had never gone inside. She went inside now, and the man at the desk looked at her traveling clothes, and her trunk, and her face, which was calm, and he gave her a room without asking questions. She paid with her own money. She had saved carefully. This was not something she had planned, exactly. She was not certain she had ever let herself plan it, but somewhere in the back of her mind she had kept a small amount separate, enough for exactly this kind of night. And she was grateful now to the version of herself who had been cautious without knowing why. She slept better than she had in months. In the morning she washed her face and braided her hair and sat at the small writing desk and wrote 2 letters, one to her father, one to a woman named Mrs. Fenley, who ran a household in Bristol that Matilda had heard about through a neighbor before her marriage. A household that employed a woman in a kind of managerial capacity, someone educated, someone who could keep accounts and correspond with solicitors and manage the domestic affairs that required a certain intelligence and a high tolerance for being underestimated. She sent both letters with the morning post and then went down to breakfast. She ordered tea and toast and eggs and ate all of it. The reply from Mrs. Fenley came in 4 days. Yes, the position was still available. Yes, her qualifications were adequate. Could she present herself by the following Thursday? She could. Bristol was not so far. She found lodgings easily enough, a room in a quiet house on a quiet street. Landlady a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Torrance, who asked no questions about husbands, and seemed in fact to prefer it that way. The work was what she had hoped it would be. Demanding, practical, requiring the full use of her mind in a way that managing Cecily's household had not. Mrs. Fenley's household was larger than Harrogate in terms of its complications, but smaller in its politics. And the difference made Matilda feel, for the first time in over a year, that her intelligence was being used rather than suppressed. She kept the accounts, she managed the correspondence, she handled the ongoing dispute with the coal supplier in a way that resolved it in 3 weeks when it had previously dragged on for 2 months. Mrs. Fenley mentioned this at dinner, which they sometimes took together when there were no guests, and Matilda nodded and reached for the salt, and said she'd simply read the original contract carefully. That is all most disputes require, Mrs. Fenley said. Someone willing to read the original contract. Matilda thought about her father's correspondence. She thought about the land on the eastern border. She said nothing, but she thought about it for several days afterward. She had been in Bristol for 6 weeks when the letter from Aldrich arrived. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope. She had seen it on household ledgers, on notes passed to her at table when Cecily was present, and discretion was required. She looked at it for a while before opening it. It was not a long letter. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who used many words. He said that he wished to speak with her. He said that he understood if she did not wish to return to Harrogate. He wrote it in exactly those words, with a stiffness that told her someone had probably advised him to include them. He said that certain matters relating to the property had become complicated in her absence, which she already knew, having heard from her own solicitor a few days prior. He said, at the end, in different handwriting, as though he had put the letter down and returned to it, that he found he missed her, and that he thought he had not been fair to her, and that he did not know how to say that well, but that he wished to try. She folded the letter. She put it on the writing desk. She went to bed. She lay awake for some time thinking about the word fair. It was an interesting word for him to choose. Not kind, not good, not right, fair. She thought it was probably the most honest word he could have chosen, and that honesty, at this particular point in her life, was something she was inclined to pay attention to. She did not write back that night. She wrote back in the morning, when the light was better and her thinking was clearer. She wrote that she was willing to speak with him, and that she would suggest a neutral location, not Harrogate, not her father's house, somewhere neither of them had a claim to. She named a hotel in Bath, that she knew to have a decent dining room and a reputation for discretion, and she suggested the following Thursday, which gave them both time to arrange travel, and which happened to be the day she already had free from her work at Mrs. Fenley's. She sealed the letter and sent it. Then she went to work and managed an exceptionally difficult correspondence with a tile merchant who had, she suspected, been taking advantage of the household's previous disorganization to inflate his quarterly invoice. By noon she had found the discrepancy and drafted a letter that corrected it with perfect politeness, and the faintest possible suggestion that she would be checking the next invoice equally carefully. The tile merchant's response arrived the following Tuesday, with a revised figure and no further comment. She allowed herself a small, private satisfaction. Aldrich was already seated when she arrived in Bath. This surprised her slightly. She had expected to wait. He stood when she entered, and she noticed that he looked, in some way she couldn't entirely define, like a man who had been doing his own thinking and had not found the results comfortable. He asked if she would sit. She sat. They ordered tea. There was a silence that was not entirely hostile, which she considered, under the circumstances, a reasonable starting point. He said, I didn't know what Cecily was doing. She considered this. She said, I think you did. I think you found it easier not to look. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, I think that's right. She had not expected him to agree so directly. She had prepared in her mind for the negotiation that would follow the usual denials. His agreement moved things somewhere she hadn't mapped. She said, if I were to consider returning, and she watched him very carefully when she said this, there would need to be changes that were real and not discussed over dinner and forgotten by morning. He said, what changes? She told him. She was specific. She had been working on the specifics since the night she'd lain awake with the word fair in her mind. Cecily would remain at Harrogate if Cecily chose to remain, but Cecily would not manage the household. The household would be managed by Matilda, without commentary, without the kind of consultation that was actually instruction, without the quiet campaign of small corrections that added up, over months, to something that felt like being unmade. She would have a room of her own, not a shared dressing room, a proper room, for reading and correspondence and being alone when she needed to be alone. She would have an allowance that was her own and not accounted for to anyone, and she would have his word, not his promise. She was past promises, his actual, demonstrated, consistent word, proved over time, that if she spoke to him about something that mattered, he would not be silent. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, the room I can give you today, the allowance I can arrange by the end of the month. Cecily. He paused. Cecily will not like it, she said. I know, he said. She may decide to leave, she said. I know that too. There was a long pause. Outside a carriage went by. Someone laughed at the next table. He said, you know, the night you left I sat in the study until nearly 3 in the morning. I kept thinking about what I would have said, if I'd been the kind of man who said things. She looked at him. He said, I would have said that I knew you were better than how you'd been treated, and I'd been a coward about it, and I was sorry. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's a reasonable thing to have said. She returned to Mrs. Fenley's that evening. She sat at the small writing desk in her room, in Mrs. Torrance's house, and she thought for a long time about what it meant to go back to something, and whether going back was a form of defeat or a form of choice, and how you knew the difference. What she kept coming back to was this. She had left Harrogate in the middle of the night, with a trunk she had packed herself, and enough money she had saved herself. And she had found work and lodging and professional respect and a tile merchant who would never over-invoice her household again. And none of that had required Aldrich Caldwell, or Cecily Caldwell, or anyone at that dingroom table. She had proved to herself what she needed to prove. Going back, if she went back, would not undo that. She wrote to Mrs. Fenley the following morning to give notice. Mrs. Fenley, to her credit, said she understood, and that the position would be held for 30 days in case Matilda found she needed it, and that the offer would remain open regardless. Matilda thanked her, meaning it completely. She wrote to her father. She told him she was well. She told him she was going back to Wiltshire. She told him she had negotiated the terms herself and she thought they were fair. She used that word deliberately. And she would write again once she was settled. Her father wrote back within the week. He said, in the careful way he had of saying things he actually felt, that he was glad, and that her mother would have been proud of her, and that the land on the eastern border had always been hers, and he thought she'd always known what to do with it. She read that letter twice. She arrived at Harrogate on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The elms along the drive were beginning to come in. She had forgotten, in the months away, how the light looked on those trees when the new leaves were small and pale, and the sun came through them at an angle. Aldrich met her at the door. Not the footman, not the housekeeper, Aldrich. He took her trunk. He was not graceful about it. It was clear he did not often carry things himself, but he did it, and she found she respected the effort more for its awkwardness than she would have for its ease. Cecily was in the drawing room. Matilda had thought about this moment. She had thought about it on the coach from Bristol and the night before she left and the morning of, drinking tea at Mrs. Torrance's kitchen table while the kettle was still warm. She had thought about what Cecily would say, and what she would not say, and whether there would be a scene, and whether a scene would be preferable to what Cecily was actually capable of, which was a long, strategic silence, followed by months of carefully calibrated inconvenience. What Cecily actually did was stand up when Matilda entered the room. She stood up, and she looked at Matilda, and she said, I've moved my correspondence to the east sitting room. A pause. It has better light. It was not an apology. Cecily Caldwell was not going to apologize. But it was. Matilda understood this in the way one understands things that are not quite said. A concession, a small, precise, deliberate concession, given in the only vocabulary Cecily had for such things. Matilda said, that does have better light. Cecily said, yes. And that was the end of it, or rather, it was the beginning of something that was harder and slower and more real than an ending, the kind of beginning that required two women who were not inclined to trust each other, to share a house with a certain amount of daily proximity and work out incrementally what it meant to coexist without one of them being asked to disappear. It was not easy. Matilda never expected it to be easy. What she had not anticipated was Mrs. Draper. On her first morning back at Harrogate, she came down to breakfast and found beside her plate an extra slice of bread and a small pot of the strawberry jam she preferred. Nothing was said about it. Mrs. Draper was at the range with her back turned, attending to something that required concentration. Matilda sat down. She spread jam on the bread. She ate it slowly, looking out the window at the eastern fields, which were catching the early light in the particular way they had in spring. She thought, there are more kinds of loyalty than the ones you name. She thought, I will learn to be worthy of this one. Aldrich came down 20 minutes later and sat across from her and poured his own tea and unfolded his paper, and they did not speak. Not at first, but it was a different kind of silence than it had been before. It had room in it. She did not know exactly what would grow in that room, and she supposed he didn't either. But the light on the eastern fields was very good that morning, and she had come back to it on her own terms. That, she thought, as she reached for her cup, was a thing worth keeping.